I'm Claire Hubble, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as details of Ukraine's attack in Makiivka continue to unfurl, we consider what the response on Russian social media may tell us about Moscow's next move. Plus, we're joined by guest Dr Rory Finnin, a specialist on Crimea, to discuss the critical role the peninsula seems destined to play in the months and years ahead.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 4th of January, day 315. Today, to discuss the most recent events in Ukraine and around the world, I'm joined by our assistant comment editor Francis Durnley, our senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, and guest Dr Rory Finnin, Associate Professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge. I started by asking Roland for the most significant updates in the military sphere in the past 24 hours.
Hello, everybody. Listen, this strike in Makiivka, the New Year's Eve strike against a Russian barracks, basically, that killed large numbers of men. We're being cautious about the numbers, but it's still dominating war reporting, interestingly, in Russia itself. So the latest update from the Russian Ministry of Defense says that 89 servicemen have been confirmed killed. Yesterday, they were saying 63. That was from Lieutenant General Sergei Sevrukov, who's the deputy head of their military political department. And he also indicated that, more bodies are being pulled out of the rubble. It's possible these numbers they're giving us are simply the positively identified victims, and that we're going to see this number go up further. As we noted yesterday, this is, we're pretty sure, the largest single loss of life that the Russians have admitted to. So even if more men were lost when the cruiser Moskva was sunk earlier in the war, this is the highest single loss of life in a single incident the Russians have admitted to since the war began, which, talks about how serious this is. Now, he's already laid the blame. General Sevrukov said that, quote, currently a commission is working to investigate the circumstances of what happened, but it's already obvious that the main reason for what happened was the turning on and massive use by personnel of mobile phones within reach of enemy weapons, contrary to a ban. And he went on to say that measures would be taken to ensure such incidents did not happen again, and those responsible would be punished. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a second. There is another factor, which is the possible storing of ammunition in the barracks, which may have exacerbated it. Britain's Ministry of Defence has said in its daily update that, Russia has, quote, the Russian military has a record of unsafe ammunition storage from well before the current war, but this incident highlights how unprofessional practices continue to contribute to Russia's high casualty rate, and says it's quite likely that ammunition did exacerbate that. But listen, I've been speaking to analysts this morning who say that that's not really the issue. The issue is you shouldn't have dozens, hundreds of men in one building, only about a dozen miles from the Avdiivka front line, which is a very active, has been a very active section of the front since the war began. And the ministry's comments, the Russian Defense Ministry's comments, have caused absolute outrage on Russian military Telegram. The bloggers, people like Semyon Pergov, people like Alexander Kots, universally noting that he did not address this point, universally noting that the Ministry of Defense seems keen to blame the privates and the corporals turning on their mobile phones and not blame the officers who put a huge number of troops in that building. And the thing to note there is that outrage on Telegram, it does tend, further down the line, it can end up shaping, or it can indicate a decision within the Kremlin to shape the national conversation for decisions further down the line. In that regard, I'd note this very formerly almost completely unknown group calling itself the Group of Military Mothers, or something like that. It's a Telegram channel that appeared relatively recently, and suddenly they are putting out demands for Vladimir Putin to announce mobilization, to draft more men into the military. In response to this, Vladimir Putin himself has not commented on Makiivka, but I think we should note how broadly the Russian state media is reporting on this. I would expect, I would not be surprised to see, a week or two down the line, a significant Kremlin decision coming based off the back of this, and that perhaps what we're seeing here is the kind of the preparatory work, the informational preparatory work to form public opinion, to prepare from that kind of step. Other developments, the Ukrainians say 5 dead and 13 wounded on Tuesday. That's from the deputy head of the Ukrainian presidential office, Kyrylo Tymoshenko. He said victims among the civilian population are as a result of the armed aggression of the Russian Federation for January the 3rd. That's up to 9 o'clock this morning local time. 1 person dead in Donetsk region, 5 wounded. 1 wounded in Kharkiv region, 2 wounded in Kherson, and in Kherson region 4 dead. That's obviously not including military casualties. Volodymyr Zelensky last night, again trailing this talk of a coming Russian offensive in the spring. He was talking in his nightly address. He puts out a video on Telegram. He'd just spoken to Justin Trudeau of Canada. He said, "We have no doubt that the current masters of Russia will throw everything they have left and everyone they can round up to try to turn the tide of the war, or at least delay their defeat. We have to disrupt this Russian scenario. We are preparing for this. The terrorists must lose and any attempt for their new offensive must fail." Of course, before Christmas, Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's top general, warned of a new offensive coming in the spring. He suggested it might come through Belarus, a second attempt to attack Ukraine in the north. We haven't actually seen any evidence that is imminent, but it's clearly something the Ukrainians are talking about a lot. Russia's Rostec says that mass production of new drones will start in the next few months. And lastly on this, there seems to be a bit of a deadlock at the front. We had some interesting comments from Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, yesterday, where he basically seemed to blame the lack of progress in Bakhmut, which has turned into this kind of mini Verdun, a lack of supplies from the Kremlin, but also paying tribute to kind of the Ukrainian defense. He said in videoed comments, in Artyomovsk, that's the old Soviet name for Bakhmut, the Russian still is. In Artyomovsk, every house has become a fortress. Our guys sometimes fight for more than a day over one house. Sometimes they fight for weeks over one house. And behind this house, there's still a new line of defense and not one. And how many such lines of defense are there in Artyomovsk? 500 would probably not be an exaggeration. He talked about shortage of shells and armoured vehicles. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that, Roland. Francis, I believe you have some more updates on the military front for us, so please take us away.
Yes, thank you, Claire, and to everyone who's written to me in the past 24 hours in response to my assessment of the current strategic situation. I'm doing my best to work through them all on Twitter, so do bear with me. I said then that I welcomed alternative perspectives, and in that spirit I wanted to offer up a few more military analysts and how they think events on the ground will unfold in 2023. These are from a recent article on the BBC website. The first voice is from Michael Clark, who's Associate Director of the Strategic Studies Institute at Exeter University, and he argues that for 2023 the key determinant will be the fate of Russia's spring offensive. Putin had admitted that about 50,000 of the newly mobilised troops are already at the front. The other 250,000 of them just mobilised are training. There is no scope for anything but more war until the fortunes of these new Russian forces are settled on the battlefield. Another perspective from Andrei Pointovsky, a scientist and analyst based in Washington. He says, slightly different take, Ukraine will win by restoring completely its territorial integrity by spring 2023 at the latest. 2 factors shaping this conclusion, and he goes on, says that one of them is the motivation, determination and courage of the Ukrainian military, and the other is that the West has finally grown up and realised the magnitude of the historical challenge it faces. I think that's true to an extent, although I would question whether that is absolute for the reasons that I talked about yesterday. Finally, Ben Hodges, who will be familiar to some listeners. He's very vocal on matters of Ukraine, former commanding general of the United States Army Europe. He's written for The Telegraph in the past. And he also thinks that the end of 2023 will see Crimea fully restored to Ukrainian control and sovereignty, though there may be some sort of agreement, he says, that allows Russia to phase out some of its naval presence in Sevastopol, perhaps even to the end of the treaty, approximately 2025, that existed before Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. And indeed, that's a really interesting question, and one that no doubt we'll get into with Rory shortly. But just in terms of other updates in the political and energy fronts, the first is that there's been quite an interesting event taking place in the last 24 hours where a former Russian deputy prime minister has sent a piece of shrapnel from a French howitzer to President Emmanuel Macron. And there was a a letter, an open letter that he's published publicly. He said, "In this envelope, along with my letter, you will see a fragment of a shell from a French artillery piece. It punctured my right shoulder and lodged in the fifth cervical vertebra among only a millimetre away from killing me or rendering me an invalid." So what's the significance of that? Well, clearly taunting from the Russians there, and as well as just being indicative, I think, of the fact that for all of the talk that we've made on the podcast, that some countries have given more military support than others, and that is true. The French have also been very important in what they have provided, and so their weaponry is being used on the battlefield as we speak, as is German, as is British, as is American, of course. Just something else in the political diplomatic space, because we've touched on it, and I think it's just relevant in the background to Ukraine, is that the US House of Representatives failed to elect a speaker on the first ballot for the first time in a century. This was overnight for us, as a Republican revolt threw Congress into chaos. Now, I won't go into all the nuances of this, but essentially about 19 hardline conservative Republicans have voted against their own party's nominee, Kevin McCarthy, meaning that he fell short of a majority in the 435-member House. Now, the reason this is all relevant is that it was Kevin McCarthy who was the individual who made those remarks around Ukraine not receiving a blank check from America, and has sometimes been seen as having a more sceptical view, or at least representing a more sceptical view amongst the Republican wing of American opinion with regards to continued support for Ukraine. Now, that's not the reason why he has not been supported. In fact, it's almost the opposite, that it's the hardliners, as I say, in the Republican Party who think that he's too moderate. They're sort of Trumpite wing. So that's quite interesting, but just something for us to follow, given the discussions around the Republican Party on matters of Ukraine, with being very, very relevant to the future trajectory of the war, arguably, in terms of the support that America provides. Although it has to be emphasised as well, the Democratic Party also have their own issues around Ukraine and fierce debates around that. Regular listeners will recall that letter that was sent that caused quite consternation at the time. And then just lastly, because I talked about energy yesterday, some quite promising news that's been published here in Britain, indeed in our paper, about how households are forecast to pay £500 less than feared on their energy bills in the second half of this year, after gas prices have dropped to their lowest level since before the war in Ukraine. Well, why does this matter? Well, it's obvious, because the fact is that, as I was saying yesterday, Putin's pillar strategy for this period was that the West would really be feeling domestic pressure from its populations as a consequence of the cost of energy over a cold winter. Because things have been so mild, as I say, it was 17 degrees in Warsaw yesterday or over the weekend, this has meant that the cost of energy has gone way, way down, the usage has gone down, and that can only be a positive thing from the Ukrainian perspective, because there is less of that domestic pressure within countries, and that will mean that leaders can continue to remain robust on the matter of Ukraine. So that's where we are in the update space in the last 24 hours.
Thanks again, Francis. And it's now our pleasure to welcome Dr Rory Finnin, who is University Associate Professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge, to the podcast. Dr Finnin, your primary research interest is the interplay of literature and national identity in Ukraine, so that's very interesting for us to hear more about. I'd first like to start with what I believe is your specialist subject, Crimea. So could you give us non-experts in the room a broad brushstroke history of Crimea pre-20th century?
Well, Claire, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. It's an excellent question. And I think we would do well to actually probably back up and make two things clear to listeners. And that is, first, that Russia is an expansionist land empire. And the second thing is that Crimea is very likely its most prized colony, or one of its most prized colonies. So when I say expansionist land empire, I'm trying to distinguish it from maritime empires. So those are the ones we typically have in mind. We think about British colonizers, let's say, stepping off a ship, right? Russian colonizers dismount a horse. And whereas British colonizers, to take this example a little bit further, tend to extract resources from colonies and then enrich the center, Russian colonizers throughout their century have tended to assimilate peoples. and often engage in what we call settler colonialism. That is, they efface and erase indigenous peoples and then replace them. So the historian Jeffrey Hosking puts this very well. Britain had an empire. Russia is an empire. So if we want a broad brush view of Crimea, I think one way of trying to do it or describe it in one sentence is to say that the history of Crimea before the 20th century is a history of Russian imperial conquest. That is, it's a history of an empire seeking to efface the past of Crimea and, more importantly, an attempt to replace it with its own myth and its own people. So I think we in the West have largely fallen for this myth. And one of the things that I think we do well to study right now is a bit more of this, let's say, 18th century history, particularly the Crimean Tatar Khanate, which for centuries ruled over not only the Crimean Peninsula, but also these adjacent steppelands in southern Ukraine. And right now, most of the front of the current war is actually tracing the northern borders of what had been the Crimean Tatar Khanate that was annexed by Catherine II in 1783. If you read conventional histories of Russia, that story of the annexation seems like an embrace of the Crimean Tatars to Russian power, but actually came after 4 consecutive invasions of Crimea. Eventually, the Khanate capitulated and its territory was absorbed into the Russian Empire. But one thing we need to understand is that what Catherine acquired in 1783 was not what Putin grabbed in 2014. So what she took was both the Crimean Peninsula and this adjacent steppeland. So the area that we now associate with cities like Mariupol, Melitopol, Kherson, etc. So that history is really alive to us today. So if we're looking at the broad history of Crimea, we have to be focusing on, let's say, a progressive act of ethnic cleansing that saw an indigenous population that in 1850 or so constituted upwards of 80% of the population disappear in a period of decades. And the Russian imperial project has been to conceal that history, to cloak that. And I think that history is very much in the background, deep background of this current war.
How exactly would you define a Tatar? And are there any other words or phrases that we use interchangeably?
Well, I'd say that the Crimean Tatars are a Sunni Muslim Turkic-speaking people who, as I mentioned before, ruled over the peninsula for centuries and were the dominant population well into the middle of the 19th century. They dwindled due to ethnic cleansing, both by Alexander II, who actually explicitly called for what he called the очищение, the cleansing of the Tatar people from the peninsula, and the replacement of the Tatars with peasants from outside Crimea. So if we're thinking about the 20th century as well, we can see Stalin, who deports what's left of the Crimean Tatar population in 1944. He's actually finishing what Alexander II started in the 19th century. That is an ethnic cleansing of this people. They were deported to Central Asia, other far reaches of the Soviet Union. And we can see a kind of anxiety in those acts, right? An implicit understanding that Russian power doesn't really belong, that they have to absolutely expunge this Islamic, Sunni Muslim, Turkic-speaking past, and then create their own myth, which takes off really in the 20th century, as we'll see.
What is the relationship, be it political, cultural, or social, between Crimea and the rest of Ukraine?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that, as you know on this excellent podcast, Ukraine is a very diverse country, and its remarkable historical development is a story of people from different empires. So the Russian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and indeed even Ottoman Empire over the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, coalescing around the idea of modern Ukraine, which was largely an anti-imperial idea opposed to autocracy to the east, aristocracy to the west. And the story of Crimea and its connections to the rest of Ukraine are very similar to the connections of various regions of Ukraine to each other. And effectively, they result in 1991 with a majority of voters in Crimea supporting Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union. And so the Islamic past, which was effaced, and this ethnic cleansing that led to many Russians, as well as Ukrainians in the Soviet period, being sent over to settle and take this stolen Crimean Tatar property, for instance, and create what they called this new Russian Crimea with its own Russian form. It has been distinctive from the rest of Ukraine because of the intensity of that colonial project. And so that is the one, let's say, complicating factor we can say here that's been persistent over the decades and even the centuries is, once again, that Islamic past that has been effaced and ignored, even here among Western scholars, very sadly. And secondly, the attempts by Russia and Soviet authorities to efface it, to erase it. And I think Ukraine has struggled with its own relationship until recently in acknowledging this past itself, in identifying its own colonial experience and seeing it through the lens of the Crimean Tatar experience. That's something that's actually happened rapidly since 2014, since the annexation by Putin's forces in the spring of 2014. And there's been a lot of soul searching among cultural actors in Crimea, in Ukraine. There's a lot of fellowship and solidarity between Ukrainian culture and Crimean Tatar culture, seeing that they have much more in common due to this colonial past than they had commonly recognized.
I'm so sorry. I think we've lost our speaker. If you could try to leave a
I'm back, I think, Claire. Sorry about that.
Okay. If we can just jump to, if you could tell us more about what happened in 2014 and what the cultural and political impact was in Crimea.
Well, I think we often talk about self-determination when discussing Crimea. And I mentioned 1991, the vote of the majority in Crimea for Ukraine's independence. It's worth pointing out that in 2013, there was a very substantial study surveying 1,200 respondents in Crimea, assessing a number of things. Among them was the view on the status of Crimea. And there, the large majority of respondents viewed Crimea as part of Ukraine. So the notion that somehow Crimea should secede was very much of a minority view. It's important that we remember that reality in 2013. Another wonderful scholar, Eleanor Knott, has done excellent work with interviews of various actors in Crimea that showed that separatism, even among, let's say, pro-Russian communities in Crimea, was not a very viable option. And that's exactly why in 2014 we see Russian forces without insignia on the peninsula. It's an implicit recognition that, one, it's an illegal operation. And the whole, let's say, display, the performance of a so-called referendum at the barrel of a gun was itself this implicit recognition that the majority of respondents and voters in Crimea were not as inclined to support this forcible annexation. Now, in 2014, there was a story about a report from Putin's Human Rights Council that revealed, at least according to this particular memo from the Human Rights Council, that about 30% of Crimea's population actually turned out for the so-called referendum, and about half of that 30% supported the idea of seceding from Ukraine. So I think it's important, first of all, to remember that history, that self-determination in Crimea is still something that needs to be negotiated and better understood. But since 2014, to put it very quickly and bluntly, the peninsula was militarized. And not only militarized in terms of weapons, but militarized in terms of consciousness itself. So we see a flood of missiles, nuclear-capable missiles, in particular into Crimea over a period of years. And then we see these crackdowns on Crimean Tatar and indeed Ukrainian civil society. So we see thousands needing to leave the peninsula in 2014. The number is still unclear. But we have seen consistently over 8 years now a brutal crackdown against Crimean Tatar civil society. So we can see the Tsar's and Stalin's project living out its own life in the 21st century, that new backdoor deportations are taking place all the time. And we, I think, in the West have ignored this history. I mean, we paid a great deal of attention to Crimea in 2014, and rightly so. But then that attention waned significantly. Crimea fell off newspaper headlines. And the consequences of that amnesia, or failure to pay attention, has been catastrophic, I think, because what we've seen now is that Crimea was allowed to become this massive springboard, this catapult to push an invasion further into Ukrainian territory. The signs were always there that escalation was on the horizon. And I think a lot of us, particularly in the diplomatic community, just hoped for the best and insisted that the Kremlin wouldn't be so reckless to pursue further escalation when all signs pointed in the other direction.
What would you like people listening to know about Crimea? What is the one or two things you would like our listeners to take away from this episode?
Well, I suppose there are so many things I'd love to discuss, but I think in terms of the current war, it's very important for us to understand that Crimea is not, let's say, this island or jewel that Russian metaphors often say, and that in fact what we need to do is think about Crimea as a peninsula attached to the steppeland of southern Ukraine, and so when we understand Crimea in this fashion, not simply a peninsula, but a peninsula with a steppeland into southern Ukraine, you can see and understand some of the trajectories of Russian aggression against Ukraine. So in March 2014, as we discussed earlier, Putin annexes Crimea and effectively disconnects Crimea from resource flows from Ukraine, which have been historically extremely important for the peninsula. So the Putin's forces cut off Crimea from fresh water supply. 85% of Crimea's fresh water traditionally came from the North Crimean Canal that was built in the Soviet period, in particular, the period under which Ukrainian administrators governed Crimea. That's also a really important story. One thing to fix is this notion of a gift by Khrushchev to Ukraine that we often entertain here in Britain and the United States, that in 1954, somehow Khrushchev, as Elon Musk put it, made a mistake in giving Crimea to Soviet Ukraine. The historical record shows that it was a rescue, that Crimea, after the Second World War, and in particular after the deportation of the Crimean Tatars in 1944, was in a terrible economic state. And the Soviet authorities, including Khrushchev, understood the historical reality of the peninsula being attached to the steppeland. So Crimea is a natural extension of the Ukrainian steppe. It has no physical natural connection to Russia. The vanity bridge that Putin has built, finished in, or at least opened up in 2018, cannot compensate for the resource losses in Crimea since this divorce from the rest of mainland Ukraine. And so Putin's forces, therefore, in February, on the very first day of the full-scale invasion, as I mentioned before, used Crimea as a springboard to tear into Ukraine's Kherson Oblast and to seize control of this critical water and resource supply, which means there was an implicit recognition of this fundamental historical reality that Crimea needs to be connected to the Ukrainian mainland. So if we understand, if our listeners understand this larger, broader historical reality of Crimea, the peninsula being attached and needing to be attached to the Ukrainian mainland, we can understand that Russia's hold is tenuous, because any proposed peace settlement, let's say we imagine a conclusion to this war that we all hope will come soon. If we entertain the idea of codifying the occupation of Crimea in exchange for a cessation of hostilities, it would simply be kicking the can down the road. At worst, it would be a ticking time bomb, because the truth is Ukraine will never be stable with a Russian-occupied Crimea, and a Russian-occupied Crimea will never be resource secure without Ukraine. And this latter component has been, I think, overlooked by a lot of analysts. But when we look over the centuries of Crimea's history, we see this dependency of the peninsula with the Ukrainian mainland. They need to be joined together. And so when we understand that, we can see more of Putin's designs. We can also understand why we need to imagine Ukraine reclaiming all its sovereign, internationally recognized territory.
I just wanted to touch on your own personal experiences in Crimea. So on your visits, what have your trips been like? What have the people been like? And what did you see while you were there?
Oh, so many things, so many relationships, Claire, over decades. I've been traveling to Crimea since the 1990s. It's a very complicated, wonderful place. Obviously, the biggest difference of Crimea from the rest of Ukraine is this nearly 9 years now of occupation and the changing of worldviews and the sad alienation of the population of the peninsula from the rest of the world, the way it's become a gray area. But in the 1990s, like the rest of Ukraine, there was a lot of soul searching about identity, some attempts to confront this imperial past that I mentioned, the Kremlin's interested in effacing and ignoring. And I think over time, there was very much an acceptance. There were lots of political contests between Kyiv and Simferopol and the rest of Crimea, but ultimately by 2013, we could see Crimea well established within state structures in Ukraine. There was a broader acceptance of Ukrainian national identity as a civic concept in which ethnic Russians, ethnic Ukrainians, ethnic Crimean Tatars could all be a part of this broader project. So over the years of my visits, I've seen these feelings evolve, but sadly, since occupation in 2014, this organic growth, this ability of people to relate to each other in new ways, to actually examine their history with fresh perspective, that's disappeared in many ways. And that's been a sad development for Crimea and obviously a horrific one for security in Ukraine and in Europe.
Thank you. We've heard a little bit about Ukrainian literature over the past few months on this podcast, but you study specifically Crimean Tatar literature. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, I should say my field of specialty is Ukrainian literature primarily, and I've been very pleased to see on this podcast such a focus on Ukrainian literature, a great discussion about Taras Shevchenko in particular, I can recall very fondly. My journey to Crimean Tatar literature was largely a confrontation with my own ignorance. I had been spending time in Crimea over the years. I had been seeing in Ukrainian culture in particular a confrontation with the deportation of the Crimean Tatars in 1944. I mentioned that earlier. We can see in the Soviet period a lot of Ukrainian writers relating to the Crimean Tatars through the experience of this deportation and write poems and even novels that are trying to understand not only the history of the dispossession of the Crimean Tatars, but also their relationship with Ukrainians over the centuries. It's worth pointing out that in the 17th century, for instance, Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars aligned with each other against Polish power, which led to the establishment of the so-called Cossack Hetmanate in the middle of the 17th century. So when Ukrainians are looking back and telling them the story of their own journey to political statehood, the Crimean Tatars are very important. But they also have a history of being, let's say, a historical enemy prior to that point too. So there's a lot of soul-searching in this culture about these relationships. And I felt compelled to try to learn Crimean Tatar as best I could and to indeed read about their own literature, their own reflections on this history of dispossession. I think often, and I've been guilty of this myself, we look at these so-called subaltern peoples and write about them and study them from the perspective of other languages rather than taking the time to study their language as best we can. So that explains my journey to Crimean Tatar literature, which is extremely rich. Particularly in the 17th, 18th century. They have a wonderful divan literature tradition, great poetry. But obviously in the 20th century, a lot of their culture is focused on their identity and the threats to their identity. The Soviet regime was very interested not only in displacing the Crimean Tatars, but depriving them of the very relationship to their own homeland. So in 1967, for instance, they admit that the Crimean Tatars had been deported in 1944, but then seek to establish a new identity for them. And they start referring to them as the Tatars, quote, formerly resident in Crimea. So taking away their attachment to their homeland. So a lot of their culture, a lot of their literature focuses on home, the question of home. And this right now, particularly after 2014, is a common theme for Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, that this annexation of Crimea, this wound, has forced Ukrainian artists and Crimean Tatar artists to question what it means to be at home and to explore how they can be at home together.
In that vein of sort of giving voice to artists, writers, poets, who would you recommend our audience goes away and looks up?
Well, it's difficult to find, unfortunately, Crimean Tatar works in English translation. So I'll mention one figure in particular. I think it's an important name for us to know. His name is Shamil Al-Yadin. Al-Yadin was often referred to as the brightest light in Crimean Tatar culture, but he's also a fascinating historical figure. So he's someone who was an avid translator, first of all, of Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian language literature, and saw a lot of commonalities with themes in Ukrainian language literature. But he was also someone who served in the Red Army and fought valiantly in the Second World War, but returned to Crimea in 1944 to a nightmare because the family he was expecting to see had been deported in May 1944. He was not informed of this. He goes back to his own home, in fact, near Simferopol, and confronts a new family that had taken his family's home, and confronts the person at the door who realizes this Red Army soldier is still a Crimean Tatar and smiles, understanding that this person no longer has rights within the Soviet system. So eventually, Al-Yadin finds his wife and daughter in Central Asia, near death from starvation in a so-called special settlement camp. And nonetheless, keeps writing, keeps the traditions of Crimean Tatar alive, Crimean Tatar culture alive. And in fact, writes a series of novels that seek to resurrect this history of Crimean Tatar Crimea. So if one goes to Bilohirsk, for instance, in Crimea, and one thing to understand about Crimea is that we often think of it as this, mountainous southern coast, but actually the arid peninsula is a key part of its identity. And cities like Simferopol, Bilohirsk, inside this steppeland, have been very influential over the course of modern history. Bilohirsk used to be known as Karavsu Bazar, a really vibrant Crimean Tatar cosmopolitan city. They used to call it the Paris of Crimea. And so Al-Yadin writes about this history, resurrects it through fiction, and then also revisits these allegiances and identities of solidarity between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars in the 17th century. So a really versatile artist, someone who wrote poetry as well as prose. So Shamil Al-Yadin is a good name to know.
I'd like to open up the floor to you, Francis and Roland, so please jump in with your own questions here.
Thank you, Claire, and really interesting to hear your perspective, Rory. I mean, I just wanted to, we've talked a lot about the culture and the context here, and so I just wanted to bring it back to what is, of course, the central question in relation to the war at present, which is what will happen if Crimea becomes the centrepiece of the military action that we're expecting to see in the coming months. What are your thoughts generally, first of all, on the potential reconquest by Ukraine? How will Russia react? How will Putin react? And what do you think is the feasibility of Ukraine taking back Crimea successfully in a period of time that is perhaps, what's the way of phrasing this? In a period of time that isn't overly long and overly short, that could mean things become more and more tense on the peninsula?
Thanks for the question, Francis. And first of all, I would just say, in terms of the term reconquest, I'd simply say deoccupation. And this is important because I do think you're right to raise questions about the liberation of Crimea. And I do think it's important for us to understand how millions of residents of Crimea have seen their rights and freedoms curtailed very violently, actually, by Russian occupation. And that the Ukrainian state has a duty to those citizens. Given that they live on its own legal, internationally recognized territory. But obviously, in terms of the practicalities of the military intervention in Crimea, first of all, I'm not a military analyst, but obviously in history, we see these things progress gradually and then suddenly. And I think the analyses that you cited a little bit earlier in today's podcast of this slow attrition and then sudden capitulation seem to me fairly reasonable. I'm not sure about the time frame, but I do think that the urgency is there, and that I do think that the Zelensky administration and the Ukrainian armed forces realize what I mentioned earlier, that under no circumstances can the Russian occupation of Crimea be left, because peace will never come. The one thing that we learn from the history of Crimea is that when Crimea is separated from Ukraine, it suffers decline. And we see that when it's occupied by Russia, it sows discord rather. So it becomes a place that triggers conflict. And you can see that in the context of the Crimean War in the 19th century. We can see it now. It's been left to become this militarized bastion in the Black Sea, which causes a lot of problems. So I think they understand that you can't go halfway here. And that's not Ukraine's choice. It's been a choice foisted upon them. But for long-lasting, enduring peace, victory in this respect has to be absolute. Now, how it happens is a big question. Obviously, there'll have to be a peace settlement at some point. But we here, I think, need to be very aware that if we let a peace settlement go forward with Crimea still remaining under Russian control, we're only looking at future escalation. A Ukrainian Crimea, one that probably will have to unfold under different stages, perhaps with international mediation, will be the best guarantor of the rights and privileges and the freedoms of the people in Crimea, but also of broader regional and world peace. I think that's very, very clear. How it happens is going to be the big question. I would say that the Zelensky administration has been very savvy in this respect. They have an initiative called the Crimean Platform that is rallying the international diplomatic community around ideas for this deoccupation. What's it going to take to start changing and winning hearts and minds in Crimea once again? What do Ukrainian authorities do, presuming, let's say, they are able to assert administrative control over Crimea once again? What do they do with residents that have come to Crimea from Russia since 2014? Process of lustration. I do think the biggest thing will be the economy of Crimea. If Ukraine presents a viable and exciting economic future, and if the view of Russia is one of decline, as we're seeing now, and potential collapse, I think that will make a big difference in slowly but surely bringing those who've been captivated by, unfortunately, Russian disinformation for nearly 9 years, bring them back into a space where they can be reached and reconnected effectively with the Ukrainian political project.
Well, you touched immediately there on what was going to be my next question, which is on this very sensitive subject of those that have been relocated to Crimea or who have moved there on their own volition since 2014. How feasible do you think it is? How likely do you think it is that there will be pressure put on Ukraine, whether internationally or domestically, for those people to be removed back to Russia, not by force, but in terms of encouraged to go back through legal avenues? Do you think that's likely? I mean, this is, of course, it's a very, very difficult subject to talk about, but this is a conversation that had to happen at the end of the Second World War, which I've talked about on this podcast previously, and it came at a huge moral cost, but it was one that was deemed worthwhile. I'm talking about this broadly in the Eastern European context. It was one that was deemed worthwhile but for the Allies. And I do wonder whether this is going to be a very, very relevant question in the years ahead, but very interested to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, Francis, thanks so much for that question. I think you're absolutely right. This is a very difficult question to consider now because we're not sure, of course, how this deoccupation is going to occur. But what I will say is that the Zelensky administration is fairly clear that those who have come to Crimea after 2014 illegally, again, under international law, something needs to be done. A process needs to be instantiated by which either they leave, can come back under different circumstances, but we either have to hold to these principles of international law and then follow through on their implications, or we don't. And I would say if we don't, we're just going to, unfortunately, travel down this path of further escalation. What we've seen since 2014, if we go back even further to the invasion of Georgia, over time, every single stage of appeasing Russia has seen this horror of escalation continue. So the best thing that I think the West can do is stick to its principles, follow through on the law, obviously have And I think the Zelensky administration understands that the messaging here, for lack of a better term, public relations, needs to be a major focus of their attention, because the hearts and minds will be tricky. It won't be like Kherson. This has been nearly 9 years of what I'd call pure brainwashing from Russian disinformation campaigns. So these various details will be tricky. I wouldn't want to prejudice future discussions by saying how they should go, but I will say that I've seen from the Ukrainian state very serious people talking about these difficult issues, and I think they're getting themselves ready, almost putting together something like a shadow government to come in so that they're not caught cold by any deoccupation, so they can serve the residents on the peninsula as best they can.
Thank you. And just one more from me before I hand over to Roland, which is we've not talked about Navalny, who of course is the imprisoned Russian opposition leader to Putin. And one of the more troubling elements of him from the perspective of many Western Europe and Ukrainian commentators is the fact that he too sees Crimea as being sort of more broadly under the Russian sphere of influence, or indeed as part of Russia. Just wondered whether you had any insights on that and the challenges that may cause for the future of Russia's relationship with Crimea if Ukraine is able to take it back.
There's an old expression originally attributed to Volodymyr Vinnychenko, a politician and more importantly, a cultural figure of the early 20th century in Ukraine. And that is that the question of Russian liberalism ends when the question of the Ukrainian project begins. That is, the Russian liberal may seem highly oppositional in various ways, but he or she may harbor these imperialist visions and aspirations, certainly vis-a-vis Ukrainians. And I think Navalny is one of these types of liberals, unfortunately, someone who envisions Russia as, let's say, democratic in some way. Certainly, he's been focused on corruption and has been courageous in his fight against corruption. But unfortunately, he's, I think, symptomatic of a type of Russian liberal that has not taken on board the experiences of non-Russian peoples, not only in the period of the Russian Empire, but also the Soviet Union. And he needs to confront that most directly, as many Russian liberals do. So his view on Crimea, this notion of, well, Crimea is not a sandwich that can be passed back and forth, I think is unfortunate, frankly, and it's not one that shows a true broad understanding of the complexities of the Crimean Peninsula, and particularly, again, this is something we have to focus on, the economic and geographical dependency of the peninsula on the Ukrainian steppeland, which is, again, why we saw on the 24th of February troops push from Crimea into Kherson to claim that access to the northern Crimean Canal, because after 2014, Kyiv was forced, due to the annexation, to shut off the water supply. So these are the things that show us how tightly bound the steppeland and southern Ukraine are to the Crimean Peninsula. These are the facts that people like Navalny just look past, a bit like what we've done with Brexit in Northern Ireland. But serious people need to evaluate these economic and historical connections. Otherwise, we're just preparing ourselves for future escalation down the line.
Really, really fascinating stuff. It's always a joy to listen to someone who's really kind of, unlike us journalists, kind of scraping the surface of things, really kind of sat and thought and got deep into these subjects, because we always learned a lot. I wanted to push you a little bit on this question of, you talked about the heart and minds issue, and okay, it's not going to be like that. I mean, when I speak to kind of, I don't know, various Western experts, academics, diplomats, whoever, right, about how this war ends, there's always this question about Crimea. Is it realistic? Why? There's this kind of sense that the Ukrainians just aren't talking realistically about Crimea. And I think there's two reasons. One, because if you look at just militarily, it's a pretty steep mountain to climb, right? It's a peninsula, it's got a narrow isthmus, it's heavily militarized, all of that. So that's probably going to be tricky if you're going to do it that way. And the second thing they're thinking about is, well, there's two things really. One is this urge for the Russians to give Russians something. Maybe the Russians won't accept that. Maybe Putin will go nuclear. But the other thing that always comes up is like, look, it is not going to be like Kherson. It is not going to be like Kharkiv. Right? This is going to be a Ukrainian army going in to take control of a largely hostile population. That seems to be the assumption amongst many people who watch this. And I'm just interested in your comments. I mean, you point out that, as late as 2013, most people, had no interest in separatism, or at least that's what the polls say. But it has been 8 years. Maidan did change things. The atmosphere during the annexation was pretty febrile. I mean, especially in Sevastopol, which is kind of, distinct in its kind of Russian militariness from the rest of the peninsula. I mean, is your contention that those people have got it wrong? Actually, there's a sizable silent proportion of the population in Crimea who would either welcome or at least acquiesce to the Ukrainians advancing, or do you think no? Actually, this is a serious issue, and it's one that the Ukrainians are going to have to confront? Because I can't think of, with the exception of some parts of Donbass, another place where I could see Ukrainian soldiers, if they get in there, worried about walking down the street potentially.
Roland, I completely agree that one can never underestimate the challenge. And I do think that we need to acknowledge that this question often relies on a vision of a military deoccupation of Crimea. I think there are a lot of ways in which we can see deoccupation taking place. I think a massive defeat of the Russian military in other parts of the battlefield can bring apart a broader collapse. I'm not talking about a palace coup, but I do think if we look at so many wars in human history, that defeat in one place can lead to defeat in another. The bigger question is, are we envisioning that, Ukrainian soldiers are going to be walking down the street, as you said before? I'm not sure if we have to think of it that way. And I merely say that if we're taking a broad historical view and we realize that the peninsula belongs in Ukraine as a geographical organism and that it's relied on these resources, and at the same time, we have this moral and legal principle that we need to uphold for the safety of the continent, I think we need to take very seriously this notion of deoccupation of Crimea. I often find that analysts that I talk to who don't really know Ukraine very well are falling back to the same logic of, Putin might escalate further, or he might use nuclear weapons. I mean, these are the things I've been hearing for a very long time. But meanwhile, we lose track of the very principles that got us here. So one of these is understanding, number one, how Crimea effectively was rescued by Soviet Ukraine after 1954. If we think about the burgeoning economy, relatively speaking, that came in the Soviet period in Crimea, if we're thinking about all the high-rise resorts that popped up along the southern coast, if we think about the Northern Crimean Canal itself, all of these things took place under Soviet Ukrainian administration. And the reason they did so is because Khrushchev, he wasn't drunk. He wasn't persuaded by this notion of 300 years of Ukrainian-Russian friendship. He saw poverty in Crimea. In 1953, he traveled there, confronted so many different scores of Soviet settlers who were complaining about their material conditions and even telling him they'd been deceived in being invited to go take Crimean Tatar homes and settle there. And he saw that the Russian administration, that is, Crimea was then at this time an oblast of Soviet Russia, and it had been left to rot effectively. Part of it had to do with the depopulation. So Stalin deported 200,000 people who had specialized agricultural knowledge in the tobacco fields, in viniculture, for instance, in vineyards. And that led to a massive economic decline. So when we understand this history of Ukraine's importance to Crimea, instead of just talking about Crimea's importance to Ukraine, I think it helps us take a step back and see the reason why Crimea has been a part of Ukraine since 1991 and why it was a part of Ukraine since 1954, even within the Soviet context, which is obviously complicated. But just effectively saying, well, we think it'll be hard to change hearts and minds, so therefore we shouldn't do that, I think is not a persuasive argument. I think a persuasive argument is to say having Crimea return to Ukraine buttresses, once again, fortifies international law. However this happens, it will have to be a phased approach. It'll have to be very much something that the world pays attention to. We'll have real issues of reconciliation to address. We'll have real issues of practical decolonization to address. All of those are very serious things, and I think they'll take time. But I do think, for the sake of peace and enduring peace, they have to happen.
You're just to be clear, it's a bit of a hair-splitting thing. But when you say Crimea, of course, it, as far as the Russians are concerned, it's the oblast, but also the city of Sevastopol. You mean both, right?
I do. Yeah, I do. Yeah, thank you. I'm taking the peninsula as, let's say, the focus here. My use of the term Crimea. But also Sevastopol, obviously that's a further layer of complication given the militarization of Sevastopol. But we can see the militarization across the peninsula, as you know well. I mean, the flooding of the peninsula with weapons and this militarization of consciousness has been an active thing day to day for nearly 9 years. So it's going to be a hard slog to do this right. But I do think we have to be focused on the principle, sensitive to the history, and to listen and to understand that there are many people who colonized effectively Crimea after 1944, who naturally feel anxious about that history, who feel anxious about the fact that their grandparents may have taken a home from another family, and that family may come back and wish to take it again. So these are complex claims that will require very deliberate, complex negotiations. But in terms of the principle of Crimea returning to Ukrainian control, I think that's key. Russian occupation has brought nothing but strife to the region and also poverty to Crimea. I mean, we're talking about a peninsula that for nearly 9 years now has had water shortages, dirty water. There's environmental catastrophe, chemical spills off the coast of Crimea, ways in which its historical inheritance has been violated by different renovation projects to Crimean Tatar cultural monuments that have been perpetrated. There's a lot that's been going on for 9 years now that has been to the detriment of Crimea and its people. And I think those things have to be faced. And we've not really spent time talking about them. We're only catching up now.
Following on from this, when you talk about decolonization, you began this discussion about distinguishing between a seaborne empire like the British or the Portuguese, where settlers go on boats, extract resources back to the center, and then along comes the mid-20th century and we let them go, but the core is still there. And you said, well, no, like Russia still essentially is an empire. But you also talked about assimilation, and it seems to me that in a lot of these discussions of kind of, decolonization of the Russian Empire at the end of this war, that sometimes people seem to ignore how successful that's been. So you could look at large areas of Russia which are, nominally ethnic homelands, but most of the population now is ethnically Russian and likely to remain loyal to Moscow and things like that. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that discussion. Do you think that broader discussion, which I'm sure you've seen this debate about, could finally the Russian land empire crumble as a result of this war? Is that what's going on here? Do you think that's something feasible, or do you think that's just very far-fetched kind of pie-in-the-sky stuff, which goes well beyond the kind of feasible question of whether or not Ukraine can retake Crimea?
I think empires in our modern world are disadvantaged, particularly land empires. And I do think it's not far-fetched to imagine a future collapse. I do think this idea of timing it is rather foolish. One doesn't know when it's going to happen. But when you have a center that is brutally assimilating peoples on its borders, invading its neighbors, isolating local political elites, depriving them of agency and power, seeking to stifle national culture, of limiting their national languages. We've seen this in history countless times. This leads to a collapse of the imperial center one way or the other. So I do think it's on the horizon. I wouldn't say it's necessarily imminent. I'm very reticent to make any kind of prediction like this. But I would say that if you look at Ukraine, this was the conversation many people had in 1990, which was, first of all, a problematic conversation because there are too many conflations of the identity of a Russian speaker who lived in Ukraine and the identity of an ethnic Russian. And in the West, we've been guilty of this conflation too often. And that led us to say, well, Ukraine is divided. It's divided between a pro-Russian East and a pro-EU West. Obviously, no one's really talking about the division anymore because we can see that unity, which we shouldn't romanticize. It's complicated, but it's real. And there were a lot of conversations about, in the 1990s, of those who, let's say, came out of this post-Soviet context in the east of Ukraine, in places like Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, Odessa, that in fact the Russian imperial identity would be resurgent. But what we've seen instead is a progressive movement, not away from one's Russian heritage, but to a Ukrainian future. And that's one thing we have to keep in mind. Russia and the Kremlin do not offer their own people a vision of the future. It's almost exclusively an obsession about the past. Ukraine is very future-orientated. Zelensky does a very good job of keeping the narrative focused on the future. And that means lots of people, regardless of their historical background, their ethnic background, can envision a place for their children and grandchildren in this democratic and hopefully more peaceful country. So I think what happens to Russia is obviously a huge question, and it's one that everyone should be aware of. But we were all in the 1980s very worried about the collapse of the Soviet Union. We can recall the Chicken Kiev speech in 1990 by George H.W. Bush, in which he goes to Kiev and tells Ukrainians, listen, don't follow your aspirations for independence. It will lead to great instability. That didn't happen. But the one thing that didn't happen in follow-up was a confrontation with Russian and Soviet colonialism. And we in the West are complicit in that failure. We didn't focus enough on the peoples like Estonians, Latvians, Ukrainians, Georgians, who were calling attention to the need for our support for proper processes of decolonization, which could have led to things like electoral quotas. It could have led to truth and reconciliation commissions. But that discourse, that discussion just didn't happen. And as a result, Russian Empire never had an accounting with itself. And we're left to look at the consequences now.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to hand back to Claire because I think we're running over time.
Before we do begin to wrap up the show, Rory, I was wondering if you had anything else you'd like to cover, anything you think we haven't asked, or anything else you'd like to discuss.
Claire, thank you so much. I think, all the questions from Roland and Francis and yourself have been comprehensive, let's put it that way. And I really applaud The Telegraph for having this daily podcast. It's extremely important that we keep focus and have these discussions on a regular basis. So thanks for having me.
Going to you, Francis, please could you tell us your final thoughts for the episode that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, thank you, Claire. It was really, really interesting hearing Rory's in-depth experiences of Crimea and also his insights on it. And I was just making notes here, and it's based on some conversations I've had also with listeners over Twitter, and I'm particularly thankful for James and his compilation of some of the conversation points relating to Crimea, and indeed the general question of what Ukraine and why Ukraine thinks it's so important that its territorial integrity is kept intact at the end of this war, including Crimea and those areas seized by Russia and the Donbass. And I'm just listing out here what some of those are. These are some of the arguments that are made from Ukrainians and Western commentators. So, of course, the first one is the danger of Russia having any military foothold in Crimea, the argument being that in future they might use it as a launch pad for an invasion. And I think that is one that, given what the regular listeners who've been with us from the beginning will remember how many conversations there were about the belief that there would be a major sea operation from beginning in the Crimea territory that would then lead to the major invasion push coming from the south, or one of the major invasion pushes. So I can understand why Ukrainians think that. There's also, of course, and of course Rory touched on this idea that if there isn't a territorial integrity at the end of this war for Ukraine, that Ukraine's future becomes much more uncertain, unstable domestically. local politics forever remains divided between the war parties and the accommodation of occupation parties, perhaps, or at least in Ukraine itself, you see the situation where there will be different camps within the country who will say, well, actually, we need to take back Crimea. It's too dangerous, and it will just lead to a generation of division over the question about where Ukrainian borders lie, if indeed there were to be some sort of peace forced upon them. So I'm just mentioning that as one of the points I've read from Ukrainian commentators. Another, of course, is that it would lead to a half-hearted attempt to rebuild the country at the end of the war, because as a consequence of this uncertainty about the future, about certain elements of former Ukrainian territory, if Crimea were not to be restored to Ukraine, there would be perhaps less investment from the West, private investment particularly, because Ukraine would be deemed as too high risk. Then, of course, as Rory and I were talking about earlier on, you'd have the question of Ukrainian citizenship and whether some people who might then move back into Ukraine from Crimea, whether they would be Ukrainian citizens, whether they would be Russian citizens, or whether they would be in some sort of legal limbo that would need to then be in some way pushed back to Russia. There's also the question of EU and NATO membership being put permanently on hold as a consequence, potentially. And then, of course, you've got the issue of foreign policy security guarantees from other countries as well. Are they more or less likely to support Ukraine in not only its memberships, but also in terms of other military support, if they think there's an unanswered question relating to Crimea or other territories that Russia lays claim to? So that is why, those are just some of the reasons why this idea of total victory for Ukraine is so often talked about, and why it seems to matter so much, is that it's not just an issue of national identity that's in the Ukrainian soul. It's pragmatic as well. It's thinking about the future, and there are a lot of concerns if Crimea is not taken back. So I just wanted to touch on that and to end on that, because I think it's really important that when we're assessing the significance of Crimea, it's much more complicated than simply taking it back. It's something that really matters for the future of the Ukrainian state, arguably. And that's why it's right to continue to return to this and what is inevitably going to be, I think, one of the integral battlefields in the months to come.
And finally to you, Roland, please leave us with your final thoughts.
I think Rory made a really strong, cogent argument backing up that Ukrainian, that famous Ukrainian claim we're taking back all of our territory, including Crimea. However, I must say that view is not shared in many Western capitals. And, you have conversations with, I won't name the countries because, they're kind of speaking off record, but you can ask diplomats from certain Western countries in the quote unquote, Grand Western Alliance, who will flatly say, no, that's not going to happen. Or this, widespread suspicion that this is a maximalist kind of negotiating position. The idea that the reason the Ukrainians keep on saying, yes, we're taking back Crimea, is that you've got to go into the inevitable, painful peace talks, making it look like you're asking for more than you're actually going to accept, and that Crimea is actually going to be a very powerful card for them to play. I mean, I had a conversation with a Ukrainian actually, who also asked to remain anonymous because of the sensitivity of the subject, who said, he could see a conversation kind of starting around the question of, okay, what if we're talking about Ukraine gets everything else back, including Donbass, and gets into NATO, and maybe you have some kind of formula by which Russia is able to maybe hang on to Crimea in some kind of way. But it's such a sensitive subject, it's such an emotionally sensitive subject for the Ukrainian public that there is absolutely no way you can, that can be discussed publicly. And then there is the question of how Russians look at Crimea. I mean, the analogy that I always used to use, especially for British people, is kind of think about how Brits think about the Falkland Islands. And I would never, just to be clear, I'm not drawing a moral equivalence between the Falklands War and the annexation of Crimea. One was a response to, aggression by a military dictatorship against the will of the people who lived there. And I suppose I'm a typical Briton in seeing Britain as perfectly justified in fighting that war. But, before that happened, people had forgotten about it. The British government was in negotiations with Argentina on giving up those islands. Defence of the Falklands is part of our national myth. After 2014, that became part of the it was so prominent in Russian national myth. And I think kind of Alexei Navalny's kind of cautious comments about, well, Crimea is not a sandwich to be passed back and forth. It was partly recognition of a political reality that he's a very savvy politician. He's always looking at kind of votes he might eventually be able to garner from the Russian public. He knew no elected Russian politician was going to be able to say, yeah, we're going to give it back. I think if it does go the way that Rory was suggesting, that Ukraine gets it back, then Russia it would mean Russia and the Russian public and Russian elites being forced into a very unpleasant position of reassessing those assumptions, which I think, to be fair, if I'm not putting words in his mouth, that's exactly what Rory was saying needs to happen. Those are my last thoughts on Crimea, and thanks very, very much, Rory, for coming on. I thought that was a fascinating discussion.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings you stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Robbie Nichols.